Max Kellerman making his return in earnest, I think you could say, to sports media, and honestly breaking his silence on the Bill Simmons podcast earlier this week. Kellerman discussed his departure from First Take for the first time publicly. Pretty much, I think I would sum it up by saying that Stephen A. Smith did not want a debate partner that was as competent as Kellerman. Do you agree with his assessment of things?
Well, so look, Max Kellerman's probably one of the most confident people that we cover. If you ever hear him speak, I don't think he will ever have a bad thing to say about himself. So not a surprise that he would take that tact. And also he was doing it in a pretty teasing kind of lighthearted way. So I don't think it's really any sort of like revealing thing. I think it's pretty clear Stephen A. Smith wanted that show to be his. I thought the most insightful part of what he said, though, was the idea of how Stephen A. Putting his thumb on the scale of what that show is going to be has directly led to the stature that he now holds there, right? Because I think the way Max put it was like, if you manufacture the show into being a solo act, it's easier for you to make an argument to management that the show is your solo platform, when it wasn't ever that until very recently for Stephen A. And I think that is probably pretty true. And it has certainly paid off for Stephen A. to be making the money that he is now. So that was the part that I kind of took away as far as the First Take stuff goes, is like, yeah, Stephen A., you can directly trace the monster payday he got and the freedom he got earlier this year to orchestrating the exit of Max Kellerman a few years back.
Yeah, I think that's probably true. And yeah, I also found interesting Kellerman saying that out of all of the on-air partners that he's had over his career, that Stephen A. was kind of the only one where he never felt like they were actually building, any chemistry or any bond outside of the show. He said, like, when the red light comes on, like, the show was fine. There was nothing wrong, but he just never felt a deeper connection with Stephen A. And I found that interesting. I kind of wonder if Stephen A. is one of those people where it's kind of hard to get past the on-air persona and actually develop some sort of deeper relationship with.
Well, and not to get too far distracted, but it definitely doesn't help how often Stephen A. now is remote. I mean, I think that often watching that show, like, he is just never there, and he's always on. I'm not saying he is not working, but he is very rarely in the studio compared to what we were used to before. I'm sure it's more than half the time, so I shouldn't say rare, but it's noticeable. And I think if you listen to Skip talk, it was like that with those two. It was like that with Skip and Shannon. Obviously Stephen A. being remote now signals that's not like the highest on his priority list to have that kind of rapport with everybody around him necessarily. And honestly, what it makes me think too, Drew, is like how big of a loss, how much bigger of a loss it makes the Molly Qerim departure seem like, because I would say that's the only person I ever felt like Stephen A. Smith had that level of real chemistry and care for that he ever worked with on air. I mean, he's bashing Carrie Champion actively right now, who was a previous anchor of that show, right? So yeah, there's a long list of people that Stephen A. did not work well with, and he's the last one standing, which is great. But I mean, this is something that Bill Simmons was kind of talking about in that interview as he kind of weaved these questions in, which was like, what would ESPN, that show, of course, would be different, but like ESPN would feel a lot different if Kellerman hadn't left, solely because I think it wouldn't feel so much like, Stephen A. Smith Palooza over there, the way that people have grown tired of it feeling. Like, it's kind of an interesting what if to just think, like, what if Stephen A. just had a counterbalance for the past 5 years?
Yeah, that is a really interesting, counterfactual to think about. Like, would Stephen A. be hosting a Sirius XM show? Would he be delving into politics like he is if he had someone to kind of check him on a daily basis? I mean, he's kind of been able to run wild over there. It's a really interesting thought. One more question for you, Brendan, before we get out of here. Max Kellerman is launching a podcast with The Ringer alongside Rich Paul. I think details are rather sparse about it, like what the topics
Mm-hmm.
are going to be and what they'll talk about day to day. But what do you think of Kellerman, making his reemergence with Rich Paul at the Ringer?
I have not personally found Rich Paul as he's ventured out as a public figure more and more. He had a book tour. He's been on the McAfee show quite a bit, things like that, to be that compelling of a character, which is not really a fault of his. I think that, there's plenty of insight to be gleaned from an agent, especially an outsider who worked his way into that world, and somebody who's been so closely associated with the most prominent NBA figure of our lifetimes and that kind of stuff. Like, I am interested in the idea of Rich Paul, but it feels like the main reason I don't love it is he just doesn't seem to have an awareness of the pulse of the sports conversation, because he's a freaking agent. Why would he? Why would he care about what Reddit is buzzing about on a random Thursday? So if that changes, I guess I could see it working. It's not who I thought Max Kellerman would go toward, but I just think it's a strange pick to not just find somebody who does that same job who you can build chemistry with. But Max had a long time to think about this. So if he thinks that's what's going to work, he probably, knows more than I do.
Right. And I think Simmons, when he was talking about it with Max and Rich Paul, just kind of sat back and by the sounds of things, just listened to them conversate and said, this sounds like a Ringer podcast. So, I
Yeah.
mean,
Yeah.
there's few other people that I would trust more to, be able to identify what makes a good podcast than Bill Simmons. So I think we'll have to wait and see on that one. But I do agree. It is an odd pairing on paper.
Do you think it's just podcasts and fight commentary for Max? Like, is that just what Max Kellerman is as a sports media figure now?
I wouldn't be surprised, because I think we all understand the reason he was no longer doing sports media was because he was happy receiving that paycheck from ESPN, when kind of abiding by his non-compete clause. So by that standard, it's like, all right, well, maybe he thinks he's a made man and doesn't really have an urge to be a super front facing person in sports media anymore. I think
Mm-hmm.
most people you see get ousted from a place like ESPN are pretty eager to get back and go
Mm-hmm.
somewhere else. But we didn't see that with Max, and so maybe he's just fine living his lifestyle with a nice nest egg from ESPN.
He became famous and prominent so young in New York City with the music career and the boxing stuff and everything that he was doing, that he's only 52, been around forever, but young still. So it's a fascinating guy. I just don't know how many Max Kellerman fans there are,
Yeah,
people who are like, I am burning to hear from him as an individual. He's always been a part of something else. So maybe that changes.
yeah.